Although hand traps are generally considered the way to go this format, I still feel like it's worth talking about some of the potential board breakers that you could be playing in your decks to give you the best chance of beating those meta decks out there. What's up guys, my name is Tcg Sam, and in today's video I'm coming at you guys with a board breaker tier list for the current September 2024 format. We are a little bit into the format now, so we've sort of seen how the meta develops, and I just want to share how I feel each of these popular board breakers would do in today's format. So without any further ado, let's hop straight into it. So starting off with the mass board clears, I guess. So with Harpy's Feather Duster, I feel like this is pretty clearly a very strong side deck card. There are always going to be decks with a lot of back row, even against decks that aren't known to play back row, so decks like Yugioh, for example, or even Fiend's Mistake guys, Fire King. I still feel like Harpy's Feather Duster can be pretty strong because you can force out a card like Disarray by attempting to blow up its Link 2 that's equipped to it. You could also attempt to blow up Fire King Island if they don't have a way to protect it, and I think that these make it so Harpy's Feather Duster is a pretty safe choice to side deck for most decks. You could main it if you're playing Tenpai, but outside of that, I feel like Harpy's Feather Duster should be in most people's side deck just because of how strong of a card it is against those certain matchups. Next up is Lightning Storm. I think Lightning Storm fits a similar bill. It is arguably a little bit more flexible in the sense that it can hit monsters as well, but I feel like if you're not playing Tenpai, you probably wouldn't be choosing to play board breakers that are just mass board removal for monsters anyways. So I feel like in terms of what this card is going to do for most decks, I feel like it's going to essentially be the same thing as Harpy's Feather Duster, except a little bit more restrictive, since it makes it so if you have hand trapped your opponent with a card like a Nibiru or Bestial, you won't be able to use it afterwards. For the most part, I feel like these cards are very solid in the side deck and definitely are strong choices in this format. Next up is Cosmic Cyclone, and Cosmic Cyclone I really enjoy because it is very good as a going first and going second card. It fulfills a similar role as these going second, not only against back row decks like Runic, where you can target the fountain and make it hard for your opponent to actually protect against it, but also against the Fiendsmith cards where you can attempt to hit the Sequentia equipped to the Desiree. This will trade 1 for 1 at worst, but I also enjoy it because it going first, I think it's a great card against most decks. There's a lot of field spells power really strong right now, so things like Fire King Island, Nightmare Throne, Songen Summoning, not to mention this slew of continuous spells that Yugioh plays as well. So definitely feel like Cosmic is a strong main deck option regardless of what deck you're playing in. The only thing about Cosmic is that it won't necessarily ever break a board on its own unless for some reason your opponent has left themselves with a Fire King Island that's unprotected. But outside of that, I feel like Cosmic Cyclone is still a very strong choice that I would definitely consider main decking for this upcoming format. Next up are the mass monster removals, so Dark Hole and Raigeki. I feel like if you're not playing Tenpai Dragons, you probably don't want to be playing these cards. The reason it's good in Tenpai is because one, they're pretty much strictly always trying to go second, so these will always be live. But if you're not playing Tenpai, then I feel like cards like this just aren't flexible enough. So unless you're playing that deck, I would say you probably wouldn't choose to play these in your side deck. Next up are the books, so Book of Moon and Book of Eclipse. I think Book of Moon is not great this format. I'll probably put it in the weak category. I don't really know what you're trying to accomplish with Book of Moon going second as a board breaker. I would say going first, it's still okay as a disruption. It can flip your opponent's normal summon face down, and that can be pretty solid in a few matchups. But I feel like going second is just never doing anything to force anything out, considering that a lot of disruptions are still in the link form, so things like IP Masquerena, for example, but also things like Fiendsmith, Desiree can't even be targeted on the field anyway, so you can't even force that out with Book of Moon. Whereas Book of Eclipse, on the other hand, I feel like this card actually has the potential to be main decked. It has similar uses as Book of Moon going first, where you can potentially book your opponent's board face down for more than one monster, and that can potentially slow them down or cut them off from comboing for the entire turn, which can be very strong. It can also be used going first to help you dodge hand traps like Imperm, Nibiru, things like that, which is also very, very good and also pretty underrated. And of course, going second, it has applications even into a card like Desiree as well, since it doesn't target and you can mass flip your opponent's potential interruptions on the board, which can be very strong. The only thing is it is susceptible to being hit with cards like Ash Blossom, so every deck is going to have an inherent counter to Book of Eclipse in their main deck most of the time. But aside from that, I still feel like Book of Eclipse has a lot of potential, and I definitely would consider running it, especially if your deck can actually do something with the face down monsters like Ritual Beast. Next up are the free special summons like Pankratops and Fenrir. I don't feel like Pankratops is very strong this format, especially when compared to Fenrir. I just feel like there isn't anything super noteworthy that you're going to special summon this and be able to beat over right away and get huge value from. I will say though, Pankratops does have, I guess, one notable benefit over Fenrir, and that's going up against a card like Unchained Soul of Rage, for example. Your opponent's just not going to be ever able to suck this up with it on summon, because you can simply just chain it and hit something else. But that's a pretty niche case, and I don't feel like you'd want these cards going into Unchained Soul of Rage anyways. Next up, talking about Fenrir a little bit, I feel like Fenrir has the potential to be main decked in some decks, but I think I'd probably put it in potential side deck as well if you're not playing a very specific deck that can take advantage of Fenrir. So either taking advantage of the free bodies that it gives you, or the free advantage it gives you by searching another copy of itself. If you're just using it as a regular board breaker going second to try to play into boards, I feel like they're definitely better and higher impact cards, especially because Fenrir loses to cards like I mentioned, Unchained Soul of Rage, which is a very popular end board piece for Yugioh, so it's just never really going to be doing too much on its own, and I feel like you'd only be playing this in a deck that can take full advantage of everything Fenrir has to offer. And then next up is Evenly Matched. So Evenly Matched is still pretty strong in this format. I feel like there are going to be quite a few decks that won't be able to do anything to stop an Evenly Matched. The Evenly Matched will be pretty strong against all the decks that aren't ending on Desiree for the most part. Probably a very solid side deck option. I would never really main deck this card. It's just not suitable unless you're playing a deck that only has room for a few board breakers. Then in that case, you probably want to play cards like Evenly and Dark Ruler and Droplets, which can maybe single-handedly break a board on its own. But outside of that, I feel like Evenly is just a very solid side deck card. Good into quite a few matchups, and you're going to essentially force your opponent to have a spell trap negate, otherwise just get blown out by this card. Next up is Dark Ruler No More. It does have a lot better of a chance to resolve against any Fiendsmith deck. There are of course ways to play around it in Yugioh with the Unchained traps, but outside of that matchup, I still feel like Dark Ruler No More is going to be resolving most of the time and give you the best chance of breaking your opponent's board. The only thing is, if you choose to main deck it, it's going to be a dead card going first, which can be unfortunate, but like I mentioned with Evenly, if you're playing a deck that only has room for a few non-engine pieces, Dark Ruler's almost definitely going to be one of the ones that you're choosing to play in the decks. Next up is Super Polymerization. I think Super Polymerization is like a very experimental side deck card. There are a few targets that could be applicable to some meta end boards, so things like Mudragon or Garura, but I think with the way end boards are now, they can be a lot more fluid and flexible, so where you don't have to always end on the same thing, especially if you're playing a deck like Yubel or Snake Eyes. There are many possible end boards that you can go for, and I feel like Super Poly just isn't going to be able to cover all those bases as a board breaker. Not to mention also, you're going to have to fill up your extra deck with potential targets for it, so not even every deck is going to be able to play this super well. If you do choose to play it in a deck like Yubel, however, it can be good because the Yubel fusion is essentially generic as long as you have Yubel on the field, which is nice. But outside of that, I feel like Super Poly is probably not the best choice at the moment. Next up is Call by the Grave, and I know it's kind of weird to see Call by the Grave as a quote-unquote board breaker, but it is very strong going into the end boards of certain meta decks at the moment. If you think about Yubel, for example, Phantom of Yubel tributes for cost. It's also pretty solid against any fire deck as well. Just hitting Princess as a 1-for-1 trade can be fine. So in terms of a board breaker, it's never really going to break a full board on its own, but I wanted to mention it because I feel like it's a very strong card that's very flexible, both going first and going second, so I probably choose to main deck this card in most decks as well. Next up is Forbidden Chalice, and I think Forbidden Chalice is not a super great card at the moment. It does suffer from a similar problem as Book of Moon, where it does target, unfortunately, so you're going to be unable to stop cards like Fiendsmith Desiree. Even though it does have some applications going first, I just feel like it's not that great of a card at the moment, and I probably put it in the weak category. Maybe if you're playing a deck that plays the Skystriker engine, it could be okay because you're putting spells in the graveyard, but outside of that, I don't really feel like this is a card you'd want to be playing, and there are just better ones out there at the moment. Next up is Herald of the Abyss, and I think this card is definitely just weak at the moment. There's no like towers like monsters like X Pearly Noir that need to be outed at the moment, so I don't really feel like this is a very strong card, and you'd just always rather play other 1-for-1 trades that are just so much better and more flexible. Forbidden Droplet is the next card I'll be talking about, and this is definitely a strong main deck staple. It's one of the few board breakers that can single-handedly break a board on its own. It's very strong, both going first and going second, which it means you can safely put it in your main deck and know that it's probably always going to be live, which is nice. I would say the only true downside to this card is A, it doesn't work on their shifter, so if you're playing a shifter deck, it may conflict with that sometimes, and B, it does have pretty high of a cost, so if your deck can't really support the discard outlet, you may not be able to play it super efficiently. But outside of that, I feel like Droplet is definitely one of the best board breakers of this format, and it's one I would consider putting into pretty much every single deck that would choose to play this type of board breaker. Next up is Triple Tactics Thrust, and I think this is pretty solidly a potential main deck staple. Depending on the deck hat you're playing, if you can take full advantage of Thrust, both going first to set something that's important, like in Branded for example, or going second, where you can search either a key engine piece, a huge big board breaker, or something in the middle like Triple Tactics Talents, I think Thrust can be incredibly strong for that purpose. I would consider side decking it more if you don't really have a good target to set in your main deck. Outside of that, I think Thrust is just a very solid card at the moment. It's just so many different cards it can search, like Dark Ruler, Harpy's Feather Duster, it can search Talents, or it can search just any engine card, which is just incredibly good. Talents is next. I think Talents is probably, I would say, a strong main deck option right now as well. We are in a pretty hand trap heavy format, so it's probably going to have applications going first, and it's almost definitely going to have applications going second. The only, I guess, quote-unquote bad thing about these cards is that most opponents are going to be pretty wary about playing into these cards, so there are going to be times against maybe the better opponents who respect these cards that they're just going to sit dead in your hand, but I think it's a price that's worth paying just because of how strong these cards are, regardless of the situation, both going first and second. Next up is Ultimate Slayer, and I think Ultimate Slayer is a very strong card if your deck can actually afford to play it. There are few good targets to send for every single type. So for example, for fusions, you can send Entis or Garura. Against synchro decks, you can send either Omega or the Wind Pegasus. Against XD decks, you can send Mirror Logic Aggregator, and of course against Links, you can send the Evil Twin Link 4. So if your deck can actually support these different targets, I feel like Ultimate Slayer is a very solid 2-for-1 board breaker all the time. It actually does a very good job of cracking those boards and potentially either giving you an additional way to force something out or extra advantage through a card like Garura, but not every deck can play it. So I definitely consider siding it if your deck can play it. Next up is Twin Twisters, and I don't really think Twin Twisters is a very good board breaker this format. It's almost strictly just worse than Cosmic and the mass board clears in every sense. It doesn't really hit enough cards compared to the mass board breakers, and it still destroys, unlike Cosmic Cyclone, which can get around a card like Runic Hugin. So I feel like Twin Twisters is just sort of the worst of both worlds, and for that reason, I'm probably going to put it in the weak category. I definitely wouldn't play this as my choice of back row removal. If you don't need mass board clears, I would just play Cosmic. If you prefer mass board clears, I'd just play Harpy's Feather Duster instead. Next up are the stealing cards like Change of Heart, Mind Control, and Snatch Steal. I think these are still very strong. In most decks, being able to take your opponent's monsters and either link them off or use their effects, I feel like there are a few good monsters you can take on most end boards. Nowadays with Appaloosa gone, maybe it's slightly worse than it was before, since you can't just attempt to steal Appaloosa and turn off the rest of your opponent's interruptions. But I would say worst case scenario, it's still trading 1-for-1 with an interruption, and best case scenario, you've taken away an interruption plus gained some advantage off of that through an extra body. So I feel like the stealing cards are very strong side deck options. I wouldn't really play them in the main deck unless you're playing Tempai, because they just don't do anything going first, but going second, I think they're strong enough to be in most people's side decks. Next up is Metaltronus, and while I do think that Metaltronus has a lot of potential in mirror matches and is incredibly strong in those mirror matches, it can't be anything more than a strong side deck card. If you're playing like the best deck like Yugioh, for example, you can certainly side this, and you can very reasonably expect to play against a lot of Yugioh at a big tournament, where this card will be super good, both going first and going second. But if you're not playing a super common top tier deck, then I don't really feel like this card is worth it, because you're just not going to have too many of the best targets available to you to summon off of this, and won't be able to get full value off of it. But if your deck can support it, I definitely feel like this is a very solid card. Next up is Kurikara Div Incarnate, and I don't think this card is very good at the moment. I feel like a lot of the disruptions are either just not going to care too much about being tributed once they're used, and there aren't too many monsters that have multiple interruptions on the board they can use again and again, like a card like Appaloosa did in the past. So I feel like this is probably just a weak choice at the moment, and I probably choose to play something else over this for sure. Next up are the tributing monsters, so things like Santa Claus and Kaijus, Lava Golem, and Sphere Mode. So starting off with Santa Claus, I think this is maybe okay if you're playing like Tenbai Dragons and you need to clear out a card like Kiki Nagashi Fuko. But outside of that, I don't really think these are very good at the moment. There's a lot better cards that trade 1-for-1 with your opponent, and I don't feel like there are too many towers-like monsters right now, like I mentioned with Herald of the Abyss. So I think Kaijus are pretty weak at the moment. Lava Golem and Sphere Mode, on the other hand, I think are pretty solid side deck options. These are one of the few board breakers that can single-handedly clear out a board on its own. So if you think about the potential end boards your opponents are ending on, things like Phantom View Bell, Unchained Soul of Rage, Fiendsmith Desiree, like things like that, they're going to have multiple bodies on the board that you need to deal with. So if your deck can support the cost of playing these cards of not being able to normal summon, I think they're pretty strong. I probably put Lava Golem in like potential side deck because it is almost just worse than Sphere Mode if your deck's choosing to play these monsters anyways, because it only tributes to Sphere Mode. If your deck can play it, is very strong. Lava Golem, not so much. Maybe if you want extra copies of Sphere Mode, Lava Golem could be okay. There just aren't that many matchups I can think of off the top of my head where that will only put 2 monsters on the board that need to be outed, as opposed to 3 with where Sphere Mode would just be better. Finally, enemy controller. It does have some potential going first where you can use it as an interruption. Going second, maybe it's okay to help you dodge cards like SP Little Knight or cards like Unchained Soul of Rage. It could have some applications there. It could force out multiple things in that case, help your guys get around targeting. I think it's generally an okay card, but the cost is a little bit steep, and I'm not really too sure of what decks can take full advantage of its effects at the moment. So I'd probably just put this in the potential side deck tier. Maybe there's a deck out there that can use this card really well, but out of all the meta decks off the top of my head, I don't really think any of them are able to really maximize their utility that they're getting out of enemy controller. Finally, I forgot to put this card on the list, but I did want to talk a little bit about Vesper Girsu. Vesper Girsu, I think, is a very interesting card. It does have some applications going first, where if you can set essentially as a pseudo board clear or force your opponent to make a very difficult choice. Because when going first, your opponent's playing into your board, they're trying to commit stuff to the field, and once they commit like a few cards off their 1-card combo, if you just flip it then, it can be very strong, because if your opponent chooses to keep 2 or more monsters, they're really not doing anything for the rest of the turn, either losing the extenders in their hand or they're not activating monster effects for the rest of the turn, which of course will just shut out most combo decks completely. But I think going second as a board breaker, though, it does leave a little bit to be desired. It is something you can just chain to, and it is something that you're almost forced to play first in some sense, because if you play it later on in the turn, your opponent can just send away the disruptions they've already used. So it sort of forces you to play it as the very first board breaker that you play for the turn, and I don't really like cards that force you to do that, because it doesn't really give you any room to think about how to best use your cards in specific situations. So while I do think that Vesper Girsu has some potential and probably will see some play in the future, I probably just put it in the potential side deck tier for now. But I'm curious to know what you guys think about this card in the comment section below. I don't see it being talked about a lot, but I personally feel like it has a lot of potential, but maybe there's something I'm missing with it, or if I'm underestimating or overestimating it. So do let me know in the comment section. Well, that's going to do it for the tier list. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Let me know what you think about it. If you agree, disagree, if you think there are cards I missed, or if you think that certain cards should have gone in different categories, do let me know in the comment section below. But with all that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I will see you on the next one. Take care.